thankful. Thank you so much, Keith. Thank you for just your faithful using of God's gifts for you and the messages. I'm thankful, and I really think you just preached this sermon. So I'm thankful for that too. I don't have to say very much. Didn't we have a conversation about that last night, Jean? Maybe I'm not supposed to speak today. So, we're doing this series called Sunday School Sermons, and if you've been here, we've done Noah, David and Goliath, and Jonah. So now, if you look at our scripture for today, we're going to be reading from Joshua. So, what do you know about Joshua? Say that louder, Kathy. So, yes, and that song has been in my head all week long. So I think we should put it all in your heads too, so that y'all can remember what today's sermon was about. Y'all know the song? Joshua fit the battle of Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. Joshua fit the battle of Jericho, and the walls came a-tumbling down. You may talk about your men of Gideon, you may brag about your men of Saul. There's none like good old Joshua and the battle of Jericho. Joshua fit the battle of Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. Joshua fit the battle of Jericho, and the walls came a-tumbling down. Good job. Okay. Yes. So we know that about Joshua. You know anything else about Joshua?
He was Moses' right-hand man.
Moses' right-hand man, yes.
And he was very, very faithful.
Very faithful. Like, faithful and full of faith. Yeah.
Didn't he bring in Israelites into the new?
Yes. So when Moses was not allowed to enter into the promised land, and so that baton was handed from Moses to Joshua, and so Joshua was the leader of the Israelites as they entered into the promised land.
And there was only he and one other guy that was from the original Exodus from
Right.
that went in, yeah.
And the reason for that, they sent those 12 spies ahead of time into the land to scout it all out, check out the cities, check out the people, and only 2 came back with a report. They all said, these are big fortified cities, these are big people, but there are only 2 of them that said, we can still do this. Joshua and Caleb. And so Joshua and Caleb were the exception to that whole generation passing away in the desert before they entered into Canaan. You guys know a lot about Joshua. So, where we're at, where I'm going to start the scripture reading today. So, the Israelites, they have stepped into the promised land, and one of the first things that they did was they had to cross the River Jordan. And we're very familiar with the Red Sea and Moses parting the Red Sea. I feel like that's a well-known story. But God did the same thing for them as they passed through the Jordan River. He stopped up the river so that they could pass through. I'm going to read just a passage from Joshua chapter 3. He says, "This is how you will know that the living God is among you, and that he will certainly drive out before you the Canaanites, Hittites, Hivites, Perizzites, Girgashites, Amorites, and the Jebusites. See, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of the earth will go into the Jordan ahead of you." So they had this ark that represented the presence of God, and it had to be carried on poles by the priests. And so they stepped into the river first with the ark, and then it says that when they set foot in the Jordan, its waters flowing downstream will be cut off and stand up in a heap. Can you imagine that? that the water just, like, it was flowing down and it just was building this wall so that they could pass through. So much like Moses experienced that with the Red Sea, Joshua experienced that with this new generation as they were entering into Canaan land. So the parting of the Jordan River confirmed that God was present with them. It was miraculous, right? And so if you saw that, if you witnessed that, you were like, no, God is with us. And but there was something else that they had to do before they began overtaking this land, and that was in chapter 5. God prepares them not in a military sense, but in a spiritual sense. So the first thing they had to do was all of the males were circumcised. So while that was a practice that had been started with Abraham, and that was a means to set themselves apart for God. And so it was symbolic, but that had not happened while they were in the desert. So this whole generation of Israelites became circumcised, and then they celebrated the Passover. They took the time to remember what God had done for them in the past before they set their feet forward into the promised land. So all of this strengthened and reinforced their faith. And then remember how they ate in the desert. God provided manna every day. God still provided manna even when they were on the outskirts of the promised land. But once they had become circumcised, once they had celebrated the Passover, there was no more manna because they had access to local food. And so that stopped. God stopped that provision of the manna because he no longer needed to provide that. So where we're going to pick this story up is Joshua chapter 5. And I'm going to read just a piece of it, and then I'm going to finish it up. So if you want to follow along with me, we're on page 171 in the Pew Bibles. 171. Chapter 5, starting with verse 13. And there's a weird chapter break here on the story, so really, where we're going to read at the end of 5 really just continues into chapter 6. So what we're going to find out is that Joshua has this kind of odd encounter with this guy. So verse 13, once when Joshua was by Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing before him with a drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, "Are you one of us, or are you one of our adversaries?" And he replied, "Neither, but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come." And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped. And he said to him, "What do you command your servant, my Lord?" And the commander of the army of the Lord said to Joshua, "Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place where you stand is holy." And Joshua did so. Now Jericho was shut up inside and out because of the Israelites. No one came out and no one went in. The Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have handed Jericho over to you, along with its king and soldiers. You shall march around the city, all the warriors circling the city once. Thus you shall do for 6 days, with 7 priests bearing 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. On the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priests blowing the trumpets. When they make a long blast with the ram's horn, as soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat, and all the people shall charge straight ahead." So Joshua, son of Nun, summoned the priests and said to them, I'm going to stop there. I'm going to wait until Joshua takes action. So let's just focus on the beginning of this first. So Joshua has this kind of strange encounter with this guy. He's got a sword, and Joshua's like, "Are you with us or against us?" To which the guy says, "Well, neither, really. I am the commander of the Lord's army." And Joshua realized he was having a divine encounter, and the gentleman said, like, take off your feet, take off your shoes. This is holy ground. And if you remember, Moses had a similar experience with God and the burning bush, that he was on holy ground, that God was present with him. It's uncertain exactly who was this person. One idea is this is a theophany, which is a personal encounter with God. And because this individual received Joshua's worship, because this individual said this is holy ground, it could have been God himself being present in the form of this man, or it may have just simply been an angel that God sent to be his messenger. But regardless of kind of who it was God behind it. And Joshua realized that this message was coming right from God. So this was a divine personal encounter with God. So God tells Joshua that he has delivered Jericho into his hands. This is all past tense, right? God's saying it's already done. So he said the land, the king, the people, that God was gifting all of this to the Israelites. But the people needed to follow his instructions, and God gave him some pretty odd instructions. He said, we're going to march around this city one time a day for 6 days. You're going to be carrying the Ark of the Covenant. There's going to be 7 priests that are carrying 7 kind of trumpet-like instruments. And the army, the men who are fighting, were going to kind of go in the front and behind, so that the ark was in the center, so God's presence was right in the center of where they were. Then the 7th day, they had to take 7 trips around the city, and at the given time, we're going to blow the trumpets, we're all going to shout, and somehow the walls are going to come down. So, what do we know about Jericho? What was the city that stood in front of the Israelites? One, it was kind of the gateway to the promised land. So we're coming in from the south. Jericho was about 12 miles from Jerusalem. And this was like the oldest known city. So there's been like tons of archaeological digs in this area because the history goes back so far. It was a very heavily fortified city. Probably several thousand people lived there, and it was a city with abundant resources. So they had spring water coming in, so they had access to water. The timing of all of this was just after the harvest, so they had an abundance of stored up food. So as we read back there at the beginning of chapter 6, that Jericho was shut up inside and out because of the Israelites, and no one came out and no one went in. So all the people in Jericho were inside their city walls, and they stayed there. But they had resources. Some of the commentators said they probably could have survived inside the walls of the city for a couple of years. There were probably enough resources for that to happen. Like, nobody needed to come out, right? Through the excavations and the archaeological digs, it was discovered that there's actually 2 walls to Jericho. So the outside wall, and there's a lot of different ideas on exactly how tall they were, probably 12 to 15 foot tall. And then there would have been a gap of land that was sloped up to a second wall that was taller yet, maybe as high as 30 feet tall. And these were very wide walls. So basically, this city was like, nobody could penetrate this city. So what would the war strategy be? Typically, you would invade into a city, you'd have weapons, and so whoever was the biggest army and the best weapons would be the winner. But in this case, there was no way that they could get through those walls. Maybe another way that like a wartime strategy would be to surround the city so that folks couldn't go out, and eventually they'd get hungry, and then you would hope that they would surrender. But again, this was not going to work in Jericho because they were very well resourced. Maybe you could build some kind of a ramp to get up over the wall, or you could dig a tunnel under the wall. But again, these would be things that would take a very long time to accomplish. So Joshua, he's been around longer than anybody else, maybe with the exception of Caleb. He has walked through the Red Sea on dry land. He has walked through the Jordan River on dry land. He has seen God's provision in the desert. And Joshua knows and trusts God. He is faithful. He is faith-filled, right? So these instructions given by God, the strategy that God gives to Joshua seem kind of silly. Like, walk around the city and blow some trumpets and shout. Like, these walls were, like, they were not coming down, because even if you were stomping around the city, these walls were not coming down. But Joshua trusts God. Joshua trusted God to do the impossible 40 years earlier when he was a spy. When he went in, he could see how fortified these cities were. He could see how strong the militaries were. But he's like, no, God can do this for us. So Joshua does not question or doubt, and he is obedient. So now let's pick it back up where I left off in verse 6 of chapter 6. So Joshua, son of Nun, summoned the priests and said to them, "Take up the ark of the covenant, and have 7 priests carry 7 trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark of the Lord." To the people he said, "Go forward and march around the city. Have the armed men pass on before the ark of the Lord." As Joshua had commanded the people, the 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the Lord went forward, blowing the trumpets, with the ark of the covenant and the Lord following them. And the armed men went before the priests who blew the trumpets. The rear guard came after the ark while the trumpets blew continually. To the people Joshua gave this command: "You shall not shout or let your voice be heard, nor shall you utter a word until the day I tell you to shout. Be still and know that I am God." They were walking in silence. "Then you shall shout." So the ark of the Lord went around the city, circling it once, and they came back into the camp and spent the night in the camp. Then Joshua rose early in the morning, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord. The 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord passed on, blowing the trumpets continually. The armed men went before them, and the rear guard came after the ark of the Lord, while the trumpets blew continuously. On the 2nd day, they marched around the city once, and then they returned to the camp. And they did this for 6 days. On the 7th day, they rose early at dawn and marched around the city in the same manner 7 times. It was only on that day that they marched around the city 7 times. And at the 7th time, when the priests had blown the trumpets, Joshua said to the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. And the city and all that is in it shall be devoted to the Lord for destruction. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall live, because she hid the messengers we sent. As for you, keep away from the things devoted to destruction, so as not to covet and take any of the devoted things and make the camp of Israel an object for destruction, bringing trouble upon it. But all the silver and the gold and the vessels of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord. They shall go into the treasury of the Lord." So the people shouted, and the trumpets were blown. And as soon as the people heard the sound of the trumpets, they raised a great shout, and the wall fell down flat. So the people charged straight ahead into the city and captured it. Then they devoted to destruction by the edge of the sword all in the city, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and donkeys. And Joshua said to the 2 men who had spied out the land, "Go into the prostitute's house and bring the woman out of it and all who belong to her, as you swore to her." So the young men who had been spies went in and brought Rahab out, along with her father, her mother, her brothers, and all who belonged to her. They brought all her kindred out and set them outside the camp of Israel. And they burned down the city and everything in it. Only the silver and gold and the vessels of bronze and iron they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. But Rahab the prostitute with her family and all who belonged to her, Joshua spared. Her family had lived in Israel ever since, for she had hid the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. And Joshua then pronounced this oath, saying, "Cursed before the Lord be anyone who tries to build the city, this Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn he shall lay its foundation, and at the cost of his youngest he shall set up his gates." So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame was in all the land. So the Israelite army faced what would appear to be a hopeless situation, right? Joshua stood between them and the promised land, and from a physical perspective, it just was not possible to invade and overtake Jericho. But God was writing their story. And with Joshua at the helm, they trusted. They followed these kind of silly instructions. Joshua had been given a pretty clear plan. The people listened, they were obedient, and they did exactly what Joshua told them to. There were no weapons of war, but they had faith. And in Hebrews chapter 11, this group made it into the book of Hebrews. That the author writes, "By faith, the walls of Jericho fell, after the people had marched around them for 7 days." So the fall of the walls of Jericho had nothing physically to do with people walking in a circle around the city. This daily trek was just a demonstration of their faith and their obedience. They simply did what God told them to do, expecting that God was going to deliver on his promise. It was God who made the walls collapse. Was it an earthquake that was synced up perfectly with the trumpets and the shouting? Maybe. Or did God just simply cause those walls to crumble at the given time? We don't know exactly how God accomplished that, but we know he accomplished that. And his provision was a result of the Israelites' faith. So this victory came by faith. So what would have happened if Joshua hadn't done what God told him to do? I suspect that it would have been a much different outcome. Because if you go on a chapter or two, we find out that Joshua is ready to enter into the next city, but he didn't consult God before he went. And it had a much different outcome. And at the same time, as we read how God said the silver, the gold, the bronze, all of that was to be saved for the treasury, for God's treasury. But everything else was to be destroyed. This was the first city that they were conquering. So this was kind of a way of the Israelites saying, like, we do not need to go in and plunder and take things from these people. God's going to take care of us. And so God commanded them to destroy everything. If you read a little further in the book of Joshua, you'll find out there was one guy that decided to take a few things from Jericho, and that caused some big problems later on. So God did not need the army to march around the city in order to bring down the walls, but it was a test of the people's faith and trust in God. By faith, the walls fell down. The people of God put their faith into practice by marching around the city day after day. Now, Jesus taught us that faith, the size of a mustard seed, could move mountains. And a mustard seed's pretty small. And so on one hand, we can look at that and say, oh, my faith is so small, like there's no way I can move a mountain, right? But on the other hand, you only need the teeniest tiny bit of faith, and God will act on that faith. Instead of a mustard seed, plant a petunia seed or a snapdragon seed. They're teeny tiny, you can hardly see them, right? It just has to be a tiny bit of faith, and God will act on that faith. I found this definition of faith. This came from Ray Prichard, I think is how you say his name. Keep Believing Ministry is his ministry. And he defined faith this way. Faith is belief plus unbelief and acting on the belief part. Faith is belief plus unbelief and acting on the belief part. So we know that faith requires a bit of belief, right? If we didn't have faith in the pew, you wouldn't sit on it. You have faith, the pew's going to hold you up, so you sit on it. If you didn't have some level of faith in the doctor, you wouldn't go see him. If you thought that there was zero way the doctor was going to help you, you're just not going to go see him. So faith requires a little bit of belief, but sometimes we think we got to have the whole thing, that we've got to have like no doubts and no questions. But that's not true. I'm imagining these folks marching around the city, they probably had a few doubts, like, what are we doing out here, right? They might have had a few questions like, I don't think Moses would have had us do it this way, right? But they still marched around the city. They walked around, they got up and did it again and again. They acted on the belief part. They took the step of faith. Faith, this also is from Mr. Pritchard. Faith is wavering between belief and unbelief, doubt and assurance, hope and despair, and finally, hesitantly, with your heart in your hands, acting on the belief part. So don't feel like you gotta have it all lined up perfect. God can use the teeniest, tiniest amount of faith. We know that the people inside the city of Jericho, they were afraid. They had heard about the Israelite army. They had heard about these victories that had actually happened before they entered into the promised land. They had heard about the Israelites passing through the Jordan River. And despite the protection of their walls, they were fearful. And so there was this sense of doom that came upon them. They stayed in the city. They didn't go anywhere. And probably these guys walking around the city every day was kind of like driving them crazy. Like, what are they out there doing, right? It was probably like messing with their minds. So in all this story about Joshua, what do we know about God? Keith, you talked about it. You talked about God's sovereignty. That God is in control despite the noise and the chaos, right? And I also think this story of Joshua teaches